My name is Abhijeet Singh, and I'm going to be talking about large-scale assessments and specifically about how do we get them to provide useful data for policy. The background to this should be clear to you from previous lectures, specifically that there is a learning crisis in many low and middle income countries, and solving this learning crisis is probably the biggest challenge for education systems in these settings. There's a lot of consensus that for learning systems to pivot from just access goals to goals that really put student skills and student cognition at the center, one of the important aspects is going to be putting measures of student achievement at the center of education systems. So that's what I'm going to focus on. And I'm largely going to focus on two things. First, issues of reliability of such assessments in the way that they are administered by governments at scale. Second, how do we make this better? And what are the kind of things that we can potentially use them for in policy terms? I'm going to mainly be talking about regular standardized assessments. So specifically, I'm not going to be talking about school leaving exams or exams that determine progression from one stage of education to another. I'm only going to be talking about large-scale government-administered assessments. But before we get into specific issues that relate to assessments of this kind, it's worth taking a step back and thinking, why do we collect such information at all? And there's lots of different rationales. The single biggest one is about measuring the level and trends of learning in the system as a whole, but there's multiple decision relevant other uses that are important, right? One is to be able to target resources to schools and students who are most at need, so prioritization requirements in policy. One is to provide information to parents, right? So here you need to be thinking of things like community report cards, school report cards on individual students. And then there's a set of interventions which are around governance. So some version of test-based accountability reforms and some versions of performance-based incentives for teachers and students. These are the kind of interventions that, for instance, the economics of education literature in developing countries has focused on a lot over the last 10 to 20 years. But clearly, the quality of measurement and whether we can trust the data that underlie these is absolutely central to whether anything can be scaled up in these respects. I'm going to more or less circle this entire lecture around education system in India, which I argue is a very good example for a couple of different reasons. First, unfortunately, India is an exemplar for the learning crisis. It's a very large education system, but also something like 50% of grade 5 students can't read at grade 2 levels. It's one of the most unequal learning systems in the world, where just the level of learning inequality, at least in the set of countries for which comparable data is available, seems to be amongst the very worst. So it's this paper by Jishnu Das and Tristan Sejong that's linked to in the references. In policy terms, what's important is that education policy now acknowledges this explicitly. And just getting to this point was a major development over the last decade and a half. In 2020, India had a new national education policy that puts goals of universal foundational literacy and numeracy front and center in terms of what the school education department should be doing and what the state should be doing in this setting. And amongst the requirements that it now mandates is that states should measure learning in key grades in low stakes diagnostic tests. So tests that are primarily meant as formative assessments. And this is a set of interventions that several Indian states have already invested in quite a lot over the past decade. So it's a setting which is exactly an exemplar of where we think reforms like this could matter. It's at a time that we think this would be scaled up nationally and therefore affect hundreds of millions of kids. And it's a setting where there is at least some experience of having seen this at scale for 5-10 years, so we can see what business as usual would look like under the incentives and state capacity that is currently in the system. So the key question that I'm going to look at is, in states which have already invested in such capacity, how much can we trust such assessments? How can we make them better? What can we use them for? So the first case study is going to be in a state called Madhya Pradesh. And Madhya Pradesh is a large state. The estimated population is about 85 million people in 2021. It has over 110,000 government schools at the primary and middle school level. And importantly for us, in 2011, it brought educational assessments, large-scale assessments, front and center into education policy. Specifically, in that year, they started this annual standardized test that's called Pratibha, and it's given every year to students in classes 1 through 8 in all government schools. So it's a census-based assessment. It goes out to all students in all government schools in these grades. There aren't any formal stakes attached. So this does not determine student progression from one grade to the next. It doesn't determine teacher pay. It doesn't determine teacher promotion, teacher transfers, and the like. The test paper is specific to the grade. It typically measures things that are in the curriculum, and it's designed centrally. It's administered in school by local teachers from the same school. Okay, this is going to be very important. Eventually, the scores from the test are made available online. Student-wise records are kept in schools. If we think of what recommendations towards scaling up assessments, making them central to education policy making look like, this looks like a very good exemplar of the type of large-scale assessments that governments in different Indian states have started, but also that are recommended by various international agencies across the world. It's been accorded a national best practice. It's very similar to what the national education policy would want in all states, in all schools. So the key question for us is, how much can we trust these data? Right? And specifically, the big risk here is the risk of data manipulation. What do I have in mind? Essentially, students copying responses from each other and potentially being assisted by teachers in actually answering the exam, or with teachers artificially inflating grades. Right? So all of these things could go together in what I'm calling data manipulation or distortion. Think of that as the distance between what the test result tells you and what the true state of actual student achievement is. So how misleading or not are official tests about what students actually know and can do. We decided to test this directly, and we did this in slightly under 300 schools in 10 districts of the state in 2017. And the way we did this is very straightforward. This students had written the official exam in January of 2017. We go back in the following month and ask the same students some of the same questions. And then at the question level, we compare what the percentage correct was. And for instance, a student who is recorded as having answered a question correctly, how likely is it that they also respond correctly when we go and administer this test independently, making sure that no students are copying from each other, that no teachers are able to help students answer or inflate grades. And we're going to restrict this to multiple choice questions, and that's because we don't want any ambiguities in what the right answer is, or what the right grade should be. And this is the core result of that audit. Each dot here is an individual test question. On the x-axis here, we have the proportion who are able to answer correctly when we go and administer the test and make sure there's no cheating. On the y-axis is what the official data records as people having answered properly. And you can see that there's massive exaggeration in the official data. So specifically, say this item, it's answered by about 25-30% of students correctly when we ask the answer. Whereas it's reported as being answered by something like 70% of students where in the official data. Typically, we're seeing exaggerations of a factor of 2. So learning levels seem to be exaggerated by double in the official data compared to our independent retests. Now, some objection to this could be that, maybe it's not about cheating, maybe it's just that students prepare for the official exam, which they know will happen, but don't necessarily put in the same kind of effort when independent testers come to their schools. Or maybe they've forgotten the responses. Maybe they don't take tests as seriously when it's not their own teachers doing it. That's not the explanation here. So we did quite a lot of direct observation and collected qualitative data, which confirms that this is really about student copying and other forms of cheating. But also we can look at that more directly. In one class, which is class 8, the question papers were given in multiple sets. So what that means is that it's not exactly the same questions that are being answered by different students in the same class, and they're not in the same order. Plus, the answer scripts were being sent to another school to grade. And it turns out that the difference between our test and the official data goes down by between half and 2/3 in this grade compared to other grades, even in the same schools. Right? So this indicates that this is active data manipulation, not just something about measurement. So cheating is a very big issue here. And if you look only at the official data, there is no learning crisis. And that's going to be very important in thinking through, because it changes completely what should be emphasized for policy or not. So here is a long excerpt from an opinion piece written by policy people in a national newspaper. And it kind of highlights to you exactly why it matters that the official data need to be correct. And it says the principle of school education in a central Indian state faces a conundrum. Elated at being placed in the top quartile in India in the National Achievement Survey, he has been replaced with a sense of despondency at being rock bottom in the recent ASER 2018 results. So these are the independent tests. As a consequence of conflicting measurements and lack of quality data, the objective of index-based measurement systems to prioritize and identify weaknesses for improvement is largely a lost cause. Today, if any bandwidth is spent in states, it's on wondering what really is the truth. Database learning assessments and rankings that should have been a clarion call to attention for states have degraded into a source of frustration and cynicism, as well as the target of ridicule. So this is incredibly important because it shows you that even at the point that you've managed to agree that there is a learning crisis, that learning assessments are required in order to deal with it, that there is political will to scale these up, and that these keep going for 5 years, in the absence of actually ensuring data integrity, all of this could come to nothing. Okay, so that's important while thinking of scale-ups in almost any setting. So the second part of this was to try and see, well, how would we try and solve this? How do we try and reduce the amount of manipulation in official data? So one insight here is, of course, that in settings where cheating is very common, you can't rely on detecting individual people who cheat. So if it's common across most classrooms or most schools or even half the schools, you can't detect and individually punish at that point. You have to find ways that make cheating harder for everyone in the system. So it has to come in ways of test administration. So that's what we try. This is a large-scale experiment in a different state, so in Andhra Pradesh, which has a population of about 54 million in 2021. And the context of this is that the government had wanted to try out a large community-level school report card program, right? So to be able to tell parents that this is what average learning levels look like in all the schools in your area. Now, obviously, this is all only information that you want to give out if the information itself is reliable. So we set up a large RCT to see if we can change something about test administration in a way that could be done by the state, but would also reduce cheating. And the specific intervention that we try is around tablet-based testing, so digital testing. Why would this work, and why would this be something that governments may be interested in? Well, tablet-based assessments may potentially reduce distortion in a couple of ways. One is that automated grading removes one of the channels through which data can be manipulated. right? So if students are responding on the tablets and it just automatically generates the score, it prevents teachers from declaring incorrect answers as correct. So that's one. The other is that randomized test papers in question order mean that two students, even sitting next to each other, could be answering different questions, and that can reduce student copying. And there's evidence consistent with both settings, with both types of channels in various settings in the US, in Europe, and to some extent, actually, even in the Indian case. But there's also a few other advantages. One is that you get information quickly. So at a system-wide scale, so in something like an MP education system where there's 110,000 schools, running paper-based assessments, grading them, getting the data in, getting it manually entered, just takes several months. Right? So you can get data much more quickly. Adaptive testing ends up being much more suited to settings with wide variation. So this is a setting where many students are years behind where they're supposed to be. And it allows you, or it can allow the tablet to provide questions that are better suited for judging what is it that the student knows, rather than just demonstrate that they don't necessarily know what is on the syllabus. And then the last bit is that it reduces grading burden on teachers. There are obviously big risks. The single biggest one is that tablets are unfamiliar technology in many settings, including in rural Andhra Pradesh, which is where we'll be studying this. And then the second one is logistical. Can governments actually do tablet-based testing at scale in ways that allow this to be feasible in current budgets and capacity? So we did this at a large scale, partly to be able to test both the logistical settings and what do we get in terms of differences in distortion. So study population is going to be grade 4 students in all schools in one district, Prakasham district in Andhra Pradesh, which had 5 or more students in this grade. Right? So that's about or slightly more than 2,400 schools, and we divide them into two arms. In about 1/3 of the schools, students give tests in 3 subjects: math, the local language, and English. And they do it in sort of business as usual ways. On paper, the test papers are sent to school, they return to a central office for grading, there's multiple sets, and the tests are administered by local school teachers. So the one way to think about this is the best case scenario version of what we had seen in MP earlier. In the other 2/3 of the schools, we actually test them on tablets. And it's exactly the same question papers as in the paper-based arm. Tablets are taken in the school in the morning by government staff. It's administered entirely by government staff, and the testing can happen in different schools on different days. What that allows you to do is it allows you to use the same tablets many times, and that's important here, just given budgetary constraints and logistical constraints. Now, obviously, if I just showed you that students do less well on tablets, that could just be because they're not used to sitting, for example, a math test on a tablet. So what we do is, in about 120 schools, we go back and we conduct a retest, which is done in pen and paper across all of these schools. And half of these schools were initially tested on paper, half of these schools were initially tested on tablets. This gives us the audit that is the benchmark to compare results to. Okay, and this is independently proctored, so we know that there wasn't any cheating. We know that there wasn't any teacher assistance for answering scripts. And here's the core result, which is that if you look at the distribution of achievement on exactly the same questions, you can see there's a massive difference in sort of the distribution that you get in the tablet-based assessment, and almost huge ceiling effects, right? So many students getting like in the 90s and even 100% correct in the paper-based assessment. And that's true across subjects. It varies a little bit, but you can see that the broad trend is there in the difference between the tablet and the paper-based assessment across all subjects. Now, this itself doesn't tell you that this is necessarily cheating. So let's compare this to what the proportion of correct items is compared to the audit, right? So when we go and we know now that students sat the audit exam papers exactly the same way across arms? Well, it turns out that there's very close agreement between the independent retest and the tablet-based test, and there isn't between the paper-based tests. Right? So, put this differently, in this other state, similarly, we see very clear evidence of there having been cheating and there having been some versions of manipulation and distortion in business as usual testing. And tablets seem to have removed this entirely. Right? So this seems very promising, and on average, we can't reject that the tablet-based tests and the independently delivered audits give the same results. Now, it's not that the only way of detecting cheating is to go into an audit. So we also do some amount of work trying to identify suspicious response patterns, and specifically, this is based on an algorithm developed by the Italian exam agency Invalsi, and it looks for clusters. So this is defined at the classroom level, and it looks for classrooms where the answer pattern looks very suspicious in having low variance, high mean, and a few other things. And it turns out that something like 43% of paper-based classrooms that initially took the test on paper are flagged as potentially having cheated, and that number is much smaller, at about 2 to 5% in tablets. Where does this leave us? I think things that we can take away which go beyond the setting are the following. The first is to think very, very carefully about how we administer tests. So even in paper-based tests in Madhya Pradesh, multiple sets, right? So different students should sit slightly different question papers, and sending the exam paper elsewhere for external marking, even that just helps reduce cheating quite a lot. In Andhra Pradesh, the tablet-based assessments, reduce it entirely. What this brings to mind is that these are details that are absolutely central for figuring out, is the assessment regime that you're building up going to be useful for anything at all? Is this that any policy should be based on at all? The other thing that is worth remembering, however, is that if you only want indicators at the system level, so let's say we only wanted aggregates saying, here is what district level progress has looked like in Madhya Pradesh over time, that you could have done very reliably and much more customizably with high quality sample surveys done by third-party organizations. In OECD countries, for instance, a lot of this relies on assessments like PISA, which is how you compare yourself to global benchmarks. And there is a very strong case for building in the capacity for this to be done at a high level of quality by external pairs. That doesn't solve all problems. So to the extent that you need things that allow you to prioritize across individual schools, you need data on individual schools. So I think we would have to figure out ways of changing administration for census-based assessments and really try and make manipulation as hard as possible there, while at the same time collecting high-integrity sample surveys at higher levels of aggregation, which allow us some version of ground truth to compare official assessments to. The second bit is, well, how do we diagnose data integrity? Given that, at least for some users, things like prioritizing across individual schools, anything that involves performance-based incentives, whether for schools or teachers or students, anything involving test-based accountability, we will need census-based assessments. How do we figure out that they are reliable or not, and which individual units are they reliable for or not? So audits aren't going to be practical at a large scale. Now, it's worth doing for a small proportion of the population, let's say 5% or so, just to diagnose what the magnitude of cheating is. And that's along the lines of what I was showing earlier. And similarly, you want to be doing process measurements and social audits. And importantly, this is something that needs to keep happening on an ongoing basis. So in other work, like I showed that the degree of manipulation probably got worse in MP over time, and there are good reasons to believe that that would be true in several other settings. But it's possible to do more even internally with the data. So one is that it's actually pretty critical to collect item level information. By item level information, I mean individual responses to specific questions by students. And what that allows us to do is the kind of analysis of suspicious response patterns. And internationally, that's typically been the way to look for potential manipulation in assessments. Right? So in the US, in Italy, in Mexico, in Indonesia, various other places, that's how you get some sense of, in this school, in this particular year, we think there was probably very large cheating. And in order to do this, access to anonymized item level test data is something that education systems should be prioritizing. For one, that's how you build trust in assessments. So closed shops around item level information, I think, do a lot of damage to their general acceptability in the system as being reliable. And in various settings, like in the Indian case, access to item level information also relaxes capacity constraints. So not all analyses need to be done in-house, and certain things it may be better for other national bodies to be doing this, and for the research community to be helping with this more generally. How can we use these data? So even in the best case scenario that we do measure well, and nothing is, at least in the low stake setting, nothing is manipulated too much. Well, in principle, this is the kind of information that could help teachers teach better by figuring out what exact competences their students need more support in. It can help parents choose schools better, support child learning, and that's going to be increasingly important in settings with dense school choice, which is true in India, but also true in many, many other settings. Externally, it's going to be important for just putting a common benchmark across organizations in what the effectiveness of different interventions is like. Right? And we're going to talk quite a lot about comparability of results across studies in the second lecture. And then it just provides a common basis for research, allows just a lot more observational analysis, not just of causal treatment effects, but just things like socioeconomic inequalities, of learning trajectories, of various various policies or changes that happen over time, just through naturally occurring variation. So this is all in line with what other systems have managed to do with high quality administrative data, and it's not been possible given the lack of such systems in many low and middle income countries, but also, as I show, because of the lack of reliability of these assessments. And here are just some references for papers that you can read a bit more along these lines.